Hi students, and welcome to Darasa Online. My name is John Deogratias Ndeshobola. I'm a geography teacher. Today's revision will be centered on the so-called Geography 2. And with the Geography 2, it's the Center for the World Human and Economic Geography. And you remember that particular paper is composed with the two topics. It's all about population and development. But again, we have the second topic, that is regional focal studies. But for today's revision, it will be centered on the first topic, which is all about population and development. Population and development. And we will be specifically reviewing the fourth subtopic. The fourth subtopic. And this is all about the so-called the population growth, and its social and economic planning. But before we go to that particular subtopic, let us have an overview about the subtopic that compose that particular topic. That particular topic is composed with the four subtopics. So that's about the concept of population development. But again, we have the so-called population structure, and we have the so-called population dynamics and the quality of life. And then the fourth is all about the so-called population growth and social and economic planning. Why am I reviewing the three subtopics? I'm just reviewing the three subtopics because the fourth one, it depends on the input that has been created from the first one. Because on the first aspect, we talk about the so-called population development. So once we are aware about the concept of population development, we'll go to the population structure, trying to compare the population development from different countries and how do they affect their population structures. But again, for the population dynamics and the quality of life, over there we'll be centering on the three variables, that is the birth, death, and the migration. So the combination over there will determine the quality of life. But once we have compressed them, then we go to the fourth subtopic, which is all about population growth and social and economic planning. So that will be the center of our revision today. But before we go for the revision, we should just center the specific objectives. What are we expecting to attain at the end of this revision? We have about three objectives. The first one, we are supposed to understand some concepts that will help us to have an intensive review about the fourth subtopic. And what are those concepts? The concepts are like the population growth itself, but then we have the life expectancy. We're talking about population policy. We have the population management. We'll be talking about socio-economic planning and the environment at large, because we're talking about development which is taking place on the environment. But again, the second objective is all about tracing the chronological background of the population policy in Tanzania, especially the explicit population policy and its priority area. So the second objectives, we're much targeting on the so-called the tracing about the chronological background of the population policy in Tanzania. And then we'll be sticking or relying much on the so-called the explicit population policy that started in 1992. And again, at the end of this session, we expect to achieve the so-called drawing the specific cases of strict population policy. That's one-child policy which was implemented in China. So those are the three basic objectives of this revision. But again, that our revision will be guided by about 7 questions. We have about 7 questions that will be guiding our revision. As we know that we are at the point of revision, so I expect that we have covered those things. So we cannot rely on revising something without having the guidance questions. So the guiding questions, they're about 7. So the first one, we'll be trying our best level to compare and contrast the effects of low life expectancy in developing countries and high life expectancy in developed countries. So our expectation is, at the end of this session, we should be able to relate or to compare the life expectancy for developing countries, but also the life expectancy for developed countries, plus the associated problems. But again, the second question is about before 1992, Tanzania had no any population policy to manage her population. Then justify this statement. Before 1992, Tanzania had no any population policy to manage her population. Then you are being asked to justify this statement with 8 points. Are you accepting that before 1992, Tanzania had no any policy connected with population? You should recall about that one. That's question number 2. But question number 3 will be required to assess 6 contribution of Tanzania population policy of 2006 in population management. So it's all about how the 2006 population policy has managed population in Tanzania. But question number 4, based on our revision, it's all about evaluating 8 priority areas that has been pointed out in the explicit population policy of Tanzania. And over there, we talk about the explicit population policy, which started in 1992, but again, we also accommodate the revised one of 2006. So we should anticipate that questions and we're supposed to respond on it. But again, we have another question which is about accounting for the 7 challenges which has been facing the implementation of the explicit population policy in Tanzania. You know that the policy might be facing so many challenges. So at the end of that revision, we expect it to be able to respond on that questions, which is talking about accounting for the 7 challenges which has been facing the implementation of the explicit population policy in Tanzania. But question number 6, which regard our revision, it's about examining 4 achievements and the 4 limitations which faced the implementation of 1992 population policy in Tanzania. So it will be required to assess the achievements, what were the achievements, and what were the limitations. Because if we are aware about the limitations, it will be much easier to move forward. But again, the last question is about assessing 6 effects of one-child population policy, which was implemented in China since the late 1970s. As I have said from the objectives, we said we will be paying a visit to one of the case studies that's about the restrictive population policy which was implemented in China. So we'll be asked, or the questions is asking about assessing the 6 effects of one-child policy which was implemented in China during the 1970s. So, dear students, that will be the guiding question of our revision for today. So, let's start our lesson by having the guidance. And that guidance will also based on the first objective, as we have said, that we want to assess some concepts. So what I've tried to do, I will try to compress the conceptualizations by using the so-called demographic transition model. I think you are aware about the so-called the demographic transition model. This is the model that is going to assist us to conceptualize those concepts, and they will guide us so that we can have a totality discussion pertaining to the lesson today. So I think you are aware about that as a part and parcel of the revision, and I will try to sketch it so that I can put some inputs over there which will assist you to conceptualize some concepts. We have the so-called, because it's just a graph, and as usual, we know the graph has got this called x-axis, then we have the y-axis. For the side of the x-axis, we have the so-called, or we have an independent variable, that is time. So we have time on that side. And when we talk about time, we should also consider the aspect of development. Remember, development is a process. So if it is a process, the development normally it is positive, that you are moving from the low level to the high level. So because we are discussing about population development, that model can assist us to compress the concept pertaining to the so-called development and the population. Therefore, the way you move from that side, or the way you change from time to time, you will find that on that side we say this is the least economically developed countries. Least economic developed countries. But as you move on that side, you move to the most economically developed countries. We're talking about the most economically developed countries. But again, when you come up to the y-axis, we have the so-called the population. So over there, we are talking about the populations, or we measure the populations by using that model based on the so-called, we say this is the population, But But with the demographic transition model, I think, remember, it's just talking about two variables, and that's about the so-called natural population dynamics. That is birth. So we'll be using the birth rate and death rate. Death rate per 1,000 people. So the population is increasing, or as the population increases, you find the following. So when it's moving from the, when it's at the low stage, find that we're talking about the so-called low birth rate or low death rate. But again, you have the high death rate or high birth rate. That's how the graph is. But then that demographic transition model has also positioned the development that it is passing through different stages. So we have the first stage, which is all about the first stage, and I think we know this. We say this is high fluctuation. High fluctuation. Then we go to the second stage, which is L. This is the L expansive at the second stage. And then we go to the third stage, which is all about late expansive. Late expansion at the third stage. And then we go to the fourth stage, which is all about, we say this is low fluctuation. And then we go for the fifth stage, which is questionable according to that model. It's not known. It's not known what will happen. So what I will do over there, I will use the blue. I use the blue color for birth rate, and I will use the black color for death rate. So at the first stage, or at the head level of development, you find that there is a high. You find that there is a high death rate, high birth rate. There is a high birth rate. But as you go to the second stage, you find that the birth rate is now dropping. Then you go to the third stage till when you reach to the fourth up to the fifth, which is not known. Then when you come back, you find again you have high death rate. But the death rate will start to fall when you go to the second stage. And when you go to the third stage, you find that there is a fall in terms of what? Death rate. Then, at the end of the day, according to that model, it's not known what will happen. Will we be having a stagnated birth rate or death rate? It's not known. So over there, we say either the birth rate will remain constant and the death rate, the birth rate will also remain constant. So over that stage, that is what? Unknown. It's not known. It's not clear. So I want to use that model so that we can conceptualize, the concept related with the so-called what? Population development. So I would like to have a call on the following concepts. Because they will create the foundations of our vision. And this include, I would say, population growth. But number two, it's all about population growth. Then we are talking about population policy. Population policy. Another concept, it's about life expectancy. Life expectancy. But again, another concept that's very important, it's about family planning. Family planning. Another concept which is very important for our vision, it's all about, we say, population management. Population management. And the sixth one, it's all about, we say, the environment. So I will revise those concepts by using the so-called what? A demographic transition model. I think you can check it well. It's well sketched over there. That's what I've sketched over there. We're talking about the first stage there where we find that there is a high high birth rate and high death rate, and then they're fluctuating over there. But when you go to the second stage, you find that there's the fall of death rate, the fall of death rate. But once you go to the third stage, or the third level, you find that there is the further fall-up of the death rate. And again, when you reach to the fourth one, as I've sketched over there, you find that it is now also fluctuating. But that fluctuation is low. It's on the low stage. But again, if you go and assess the so-called what, the birth rate, you find that the birth rate has now started to drop when you go to the second stage. And as you proceed to the third one, you find that the birth rate is also keeping on falling. And when you reach on the fourth one, you find that there's low birth rate. Then they're fluctuating. Then the fifth one, which we said is questionable, it's not known what will happen. That's why you find that either with the birth rate keep on falling, or with the death rate keep on growing, or will they remain constant? And if they remain constant, what will happen? That's what I'm saying about the so-called demographic transition model. Then how do we conceptualize those concepts quickly so that we can move to the other side? It's about the first concept. That's about population growth. If you recall the so-called demographic transition model, and this is given, they are saying that the human population under the earth has never dropped up. So with that particular diagram, you'll find that at the early stage, you find the population of any country will be low. But as you move on, you'll find that the total population will also be what? Increasing. And this can be evidenced by the fact that we can have a recall about the world population. For instance, in 18, the world population was around 1 billion. But in 2020, we are now talking about the world population, which is about 7.774 billion. So I just want to justify what I'm saying over there, that with that demographic transition model, as you move, as you keep on improving, moving from the traditional level, approaching to the advanced level, the population cannot drop down. So the population, or we are talking about the entire world population, or the total population. The total population. So the total population will keep on increasing. That's the essence of that particular what? Diagram. So when we say what is population growth, as the first concept, population growth, nothing else. Rather, we're talking about the increasing in terms of what? Human populations. And why is it increasing? It is increasing because as you approach the high level of development at the totality, in terms of the global, you find that the population is increasing. So the population growth is all about the what? The increasing in the human populations. But again, you can talk about the population policy. Why are we talking about the population policy? We talk about the population policy because we have seen that the population is not decreasing. The total world population is not decreasing. It is increasing. So we need to come up with the statement of intention on how are we going to address the so-called what? Population. And this is a call for each country to come up with a population policy so that it can manage its own populations. And we have a revision later on connected with the background about population policy in Tanzania. So the population policy, nothing else, rather it's about the statement of intentions, which is intending to control the populations. And that population policy can either be explicit or implicit. We have further review on that. But then we have another concept that's about life expectancy. With life expectancy, nothing else, rather we are talking about the average number of years that a person is expected to live. And the average number of years that a person is expected to live also is determined by the way you are moving from the lower level to the high level. The assumption is, if you go to the developed countries, we find that they have high life expectancy. But when you come to the side of developing countries, you find that they have low life expectancy. So if you call the first question that we have said over there, if we call the first questions, which we said is all about comparing and contrasting the effects of low life expectancy in developing countries and the high life expectancy in developed countries, that's what we are talking about. That's the essence. So the model will support us that when you are still on the tradition, on the early stage of development, obvious, you'll be having what? Low life expectancy. But as you approach, as you advance, you find that the average number of living will also be increasing. Let me give you some data that will support that argument for the life expectancy. we have, let's trace the following. Then we have 2018, and we have 2020. And over there, I will try my best level to use the following countries. I will use Tanzania. Let's take an example of Tanzania. And Tanzania is found on the part of the developing countries because we have not developed. Why am I saying so? If you cross-check our population structure, it will give you the information that how we developed or underdeveloped. We will check it later. So Tanzania in 2017, the life expectancy was 60 years. But in 2018, the life expectancy for Tanzania has changed. Then it was 63 years. And then when you're talking about the current life expectancy for Tanzania, according to the World Health Organization, they're saying it's about 65 years. So you see, or you test that particular what? Demographic transition model. So the way you are moving from the traditional stage, approaching to the modern stage, we expect that there will be some changes. Therefore, it will also affect your what? Life expectancy. And that's why we see the data over there. But again, you can take an example of Japan. Japan is on the part of what? Developed countries. Japan in 2017, the life expectancy was 77 years. I have no clear data about 2018, but have the data for 2020. That's about 84 years. So you can compare there. So it means the developing countries, they have got low life expectancy when you compare with developed countries. But also, that life expectancy keep on changing from time to time. It's not something that is static. So the way you are moving, under normal circumstances, we expect that the life expectancy will also be what? Be changing. So that's our concern. But again, according to the first question, we asked to compare the situations of low life expectancy in developed countries and the situations of high life expectancy in developed countries, which will also have an impact on the so-called what? The aged population. Because we know the effects of the aged populations. If you go to the developing countries, you'll find that for Tanzania it means we are facing the so-called what? At the base, at the base we have so many children. I will show you that. But again, when you go to a country like Japan, yes, good, they have high life expectancy, but they are facing from the so-called what? Aged population. And with aged population, it's associated with so many challenges. And I think we know. Over there, you cannot be having the strong working force because you have a large number of people who are aged. And again, you'll be having, it's a burden to the government. And that's why you find those developed countries, they're now imposing high tax, especially for the working class. Then they become to be overwaged for that one. So that's the issue connected with the so-called what? The life expectancy. So for the first question, if you can recall, which was about comparing the situations of low life expectancy in developing countries and the high life expectancy for the developed countries, they have the associated effects. You should recall and make a comparison over there. But again, you have the so-called the family planning. Why are we talking family planning in relation to that particular what? Demographic transition model. We have seen that the population has a tendency of doubling from time to time. That's what we call the exponential growth. The population has a tendency of doubling from time to time. So what should we do over there? We should try our best level to come up with the so-called what? The mechanism on how to control it, and that is the family planning. And with the family planning, it also reflects the so-called what? Demographic transition model. If you go to the developed countries, you find that they have managed the so-called what? Family planning. You find that they have a few number of children. There is a low birth rate. But when you go to the developing countries, or you approach the developing countries, you find that there is a high birth rate. So what the rationale behind, or what the reason behind is the traditional society, most of them, you find that they are not aware about family planning. And most of them, they are not aware about the so-called natural family planning. But again, they are not aware about the modern family planning. But again, you find that most of the traditional societies, or most of the least developed economic countries, they cannot access most of the contraceptives. So you find that they'll be suffering from the so-called family planning. But again, you find that the level of understanding about the so-called family planning issues an issue. So family planning also is reflected on that particular demographic transition model, that the way you improve, the way you're approaching it to the most economically developed countries, it means you expect that you'll be having high level of family planning awareness. But if you are still developing, you'll find that the issue of family planning is at the low stage. We check it later on when we'll be talking about the so-called what? Productive health. We'll be having an overview over there. The other issue is about population management. So population management, nothing else. It's another concept. Population management, it's all about the totality of all the practice that has been taken by the different nations or different countries so as to manage their population. So population management, nothing else, about the totality of all the practices that has been taken by the nation so as to manage the population, or to balance the population variables. That is death, birth, and migration. But why are we talking population management? Population management is very important because it also assists the so-called what? Planning. But how do you manage the population? You manage the population if at all you have the so-called what? The policy. And that's why later on we'll be talking about the so-called the population policy in Tanzania. The other issue, or the other concept that is very important related to our revision, because it's very important to be an input, it's about the so-called what? The environment. I think you're aware about the environment. The environment, we're talking about the total surrounding. So the total surrounding is directly related with the populations. As we said that population and environment plus development, they have a closer relationship. You cannot separate them. You cannot separate them because once you develop, you depend on the input of the population that you have. But again, that development is taking place on the environment, and then the environment will be affected in one way or another, but you are just trying to come up with the so-called what? A development. And that's why later on we'll be talking about the so-called what? Sustainable development. So those are the issues that we should start with so as to compress or to achieve the first objectives. We were targeting to have an overview of the concept which are very important for understanding the fourth subtopic of population growth and social economic planning. So having said so, let's have an overview about what we have been talking about. I've said the issue of demographic transition model and how does it assist us to conceptualize some concepts. You check what's happening over there, especially for the first case. We have seen the so-called what? The developing countries. They are still at the traditional stage. You can check their what? The population structure. The way you advance, what's happening? You move further, but then you go to the developing countries, you can check over there that we are talking about, that there is a high life expectancy. Then they have so many challenges pertaining to that particular area. So this is very important to be conceptualized because it will assist us so as we can be able to do what? To move forward. And let us have a call about the second objective, which was about tracing the chronological background of the population policy in Tanzania. So before we trace the chronological background of population policy in Tanzania, let us have an overview about the following data or the following information pertaining to Tanzania. I think you are all aware about the official population census that has been conducted in Tanzania. Since 1967, we have 5 official population census that has been conducted in Tanzania. And then let us have an overview over there. Then we come up to the we come back to the so-called what? Tracing the chronological background of population policy in Tanzania, which will also be responding on the second questions, which was all about tracing the historical background of population policy in Tanzania, but which is targeting maybe to check if at all you are aware about the types of population policy that we have, because it's not necessary, or it's not important that we should be talking about explicit population policy. But again, we have the other side where we find that there's explicit population policy. So let's stick on those data. So the first population census that was conducted in Tanzania, it was in 1967. Then the population for Tanzania was around 12.3 million. But again, when you go to 1978, that was the second population census, the population was about 17.5 million. Then the third one of 1918, the population for Tanzania was around 23.1. But again, we were supposed to have a population census in 1998, but we could not do it. There are so many reasons. I think you remember, you have studied them and you can recall. But it's all about the issue of what? Cost. The cost in terms of time, the cost in terms of human resource, but the cost in terms of what? In terms of financial aspects. So if you combine them and you call them, you find that in 1998, we did not manage to conduct the population census. But again, the fourth one, it was conducted in 2002. And in 2002, the total population was around 34.4 million. And the last one, which we use as the benchmark, is the last population census of 2012, whereby the population was around 44.7 million. And again, we expect to have another population census in 2022. It's all about mobilizing the resources so that we can be able to conduct it, so that we cannot skip it the way we did for 1998. Having seen those data and whatever, we turn back to the so-called what? Is there a necessity of having the population policy? As we have said. So in 1967, you could not be talking about the issue of population issues because the number over there was too small. So the number of people over there was too small compared to the available resources, as we have said. For instance, we're talking about the area of Tanzania. You can just check it. It's about 945,087 kilometers squared. Remember, what we are talking about there is that the population is increasing, but the land or the total area for Tanzania is remaining to be the same. Therefore, what should we do? There's no way out to have to come up with the so-called what? Population policy. So chronologically, when we test the chronological background of Tanzania in terms of population policy, we have an overview. Or we should have an overview, or should we call about the types? We have the so-called the types of population. Types of population policy. We can come up with so many variables to define the types of population policy. But basically, we have the policies which are implicit population policy. But again, you can come up with another type of population policy that is what? Explicit population policy. So when you talk about implicit population policy over there, we are talking about the situation before 1992. So before 1992, in Tanzania, we are not having a clear written document talking about the population issues. And then we are talking that we are having the so-called what? Implicit population policy. But again, when you move from 1992, that's where Tanzania adopted the so-called what? Explicit population policy. And explicit population policy, I think you remember we were talking about the clear documents stating the direction of the so-called what? Of the policy on how to manage the populations. So before 1992, we were not having that particular document. Though we had so many programs. We had so many programs which were taking place. We had so many programs which were taking place. And those programs, in one way or another, they were intending to control the so-called what? The populations. You can just have an overview, a recall about the so-called what? The implicit population policy which was implemented in Tanzania. Just by listing them, you remember we had the so-called what? Settlement schemes. That was the early 1960s. But again, we had the so-called what? Visualization policy of 1970s. We had the so-called free social service provisions, like education, health. It was being provided freely. Then we have the literacy campaign. Again, we have the family planning services, which is still being provided in the health centers. But again, we have the paid maternity leave. I think, remember, according to the labor relations of 2004, we have the so-called what? 3 months for the women. That is paid maternity leave. We check on the other side, especially for the restrictive population control that was applied in China, there was no paid maternity leave. But for us, we had maternity leave. So we are promoting people to have more birth. But again, we have the so-called what? We have the habit of conducting regular census. And for us, we do conduct regular census, or we do conduct a census after the interval of 10 years so that we can allow the mobilization of the resource. And that's what we call the decennial population census. We conduct it after 10 years, after the interval of 10 years. But again, we have that aspect of limiting the employment benefits. For instance, I think you have ABCD connected with the so-called what? National Health Insurance, where you have a limited number of children that are supposed to be considered. That were the situations before 1992. So if you say, or if you recall on the second question, which is talking that before 1992, Tanzania had no any population policy, it's not true. We had the policy, but that policy was not implemented or was not written somewhere clear. Though we had some programs that were going on with an intention of controlling the population at the end of the day. So that's the situation. So if you reflect on question number 2, you can just respond on that, because we're having a population policy, though it was implicitly implemented. But then, after 1992, we come up with the so-called what? Explicit population policy. And with explicit population policy, nothing else, rather we're talking about a clear document. It's about a clear document which is stating the direction of the population. or which is stating the intention of the nations on how to manage the population. So after 1992, Tanzania adopted the explicit population policy. And that policy was followed by the so-called the program for implementation. The program for its implementation. And the program for its implementation started effectively in 1995. So in 1995, we come up with a clear written document which is talking about the intention of the states on how to manage the population. But let us have an overview about the content of the 1992 population policy. And why am I saying so? We have traced the information or the data that has been given by the population census, which has been conducted in Tanzania. And then we have seen that the population of Tanzania is also what? It's also increasing. So if it is increasing, the total area that we have over there has never increased. So we should come up with a policy that will control that what? Increase the population, which we are talking about. So after 1992, Tanzania adopted the so-called what? Explicit population policy. And then what were the content of the 1992 population policy? The content of the 1992 population policy, it was composed of 8 chapters. As they have been given over there. You can check them. The 1992 population policy had the following what? Chapters. The first chapter, it was about the introductions or the preamble, giving the overview of how the population is in Tanzania. But again, the second chapter is about the principles to guide the policy implementation, because when you state or when you come up with a statement of intention, you should also think about the principles. We say the rules of the game. How will the policy be implemented? The policy will be implemented through various what? Through various principles. So the first chapter is all about the principles guiding the policy implementation. The second chapter was all about the population development, which was trying to give status by then of how the population is in Tanzania, but again, how the development is in Tanzania, so that we can be able to relate the two, and then we come up with the harmonizations. The fourth was about the justification of the population policy. We check over there. After assessing the achievement that were achieved before the 1992 population policy, we are talking about the what? The fourth chapter, which is about justification of the population policy. And within that particular chapter, that's why we stress much on the so-called what? Achievements, constraints, and the limitation of the population policy. So over there, they were just tracing back what were the problems connected with the implicit population policy. What were the challenges caused by the absence of the clear written documents guiding the populations. And once they realized that really we need to come up with restrictive measures, we need to come up with specific directions which will guide the population directions. But then you go to the fifth chapter, it's all about the priority issues. You remember we have another question over there which is asking about the priority area. The priority area that has been stressed by the population policy. It's the fifth what? Chapter. Then you go to the sixth chapter, it's about the goal and objectives of the policy. And again, if you go to the seventh one, it's about the implementation strategy for the priority areas identified in chapter 5. We have seen that that particular policy was identifying the specific area to be addressed first, so that we can come up with harmonization in terms of the population development. So at that particular point, it's talking about the implementation. How will they be implemented? And the last one is about the institutional arrangements and the role of different sectors, because the implementation of the policy cannot be done by a single ministry or a single sector. It's about involving so many people. So the 1992 population policy had the following what? Content. But later on, it was a challenge. And you can just recall about, we are talking about 1992, and then when it reached 2006, we had the so-called what? Revised. What the revised population? Revised population policy, which revised the 1992 population policy. And over there, I just want to keep a clear demarcation because there's been a confusion, especially for the students, when we reach at that particular point. The issue over there is all about the so-called policy cycle model, that there's no any policy which is endless. There's no policy which is static. All the policies, they are dynamic. They tend to reflect about the what? The background. So, as we have said that in 1992, we had the formulation of the clear so-called what? Explicit population policy. Then it was implemented. After that, it was evaluated. After the evaluations, we come to realize that now the 1992 population policy cannot address some problems that are facing the nations as far as the population is concerned. Therefore, we decided to revise that particular population policy. But there between, you can ask yourself, what were the issues? Why did we decide to revise the 1992 population policy? We decided to revise the 1992 population policy basically based on the external. We had the external influence. But again, we had the internal influence. And with external influence over there, we are much talking about the so-called what was going on at the world level. You remember by then we are just moving from the so-called what? Central planned economy to market economy. To the market, it was now moving to the market economy. But again, when you come back to the internal, but again, we had the so-called what? We had so many interventions. For instance, we had the international conference on population, international conference on population development, which was conducted in Cairo, Egypt. That was 1994. So that particular meeting was also another important input which influenced the revising of the so-called what? 1992 population policy. Then we adopted the 2006 population policy. But again, when you come to the internal, you remember by then, especially in 1999, Tanzania adopted the so-called what? The Tanzania development. We had the Tanzania development vision. Tanzania development vision of 2025. Tanzania vision of development for 2025. But again, you have the Zanzibar development vision for 2020. But again, we had the so-called so many reforms, like the primary education reforms. So many issues over there had to be accommodated. Then what could be done? We had to revise the 1992 population policy, and then we come up with the 2000 population policy. So. I will take you through let me take you through the 2006 population policy. The 2006 population policy tried to compress the 1992 population policy. And over there, we come up with 6 chapters. 6 chapters. And what are they? The 6 chapters of the 2006 population policy, it are the following chapters. The first chapter, it was about the principles guiding the policy implementation. As usual, because you cannot start any policy without having the principles that will guide you. But again, we have chapter 2, which is all about population development. As usual, should give us the status about population development. Then chapter 3, it was about the justifications of the new population policy. And the fourth one is about goal objectives, issues, and the policy directions. And the chapter 5 is about institutional arrangements and the role of different sectors. And the last one is about planning, monitoring, and evaluations. But according to our revision, I'm much interested with the so-called the priority area. The priority areas. The priority areas which has been identified by the explicit population policy. So if you just recall on the 1992 population policy, you realize that the fifth chapter has identified clearly the so-called priority areas. And what are the priority areas? Priority areas, we're just talking about the most important area that should be addressed so that we can be able to solve the so-called population issues. And if you recall on the revised population policy of 2006, and then you go to chapter 4, that's the fourth chapter. On the fourth chapter, that's where you find, again, there is a recording about the same priority areas. So those priority areas has been identified in the revised population policy of 2006, basing on the so-called the goal, objectives, issues, and policy direction. If you compare with the 1992 population policy, the issues plus policy directions were not addressed clearly. But the advantage for the revised one of 2006 is that it has clearly identified the so-called issues, but also it has identified the so-called population directions. So for the issue of issues, it's all about the challenges or the problems that are anticipated to face the following priority areas. But when you talk about the policy directions, it's all about the solutions. Because already you have identified the problem that will face you during the implementation of the policy, then we come up with the solutions and what should be done. So I will just quickly highlight a few things connected with those priority areas. For the first aspect, it's about the integration of the population variable into development and planning. Over there, they are just stressing much about planning. That the planning, which is starting from the central government to the local government, should involve or should consider each and everything connected to the so-called what? Populations. The issue of population dynamics, that birth, death, and migrations should be integrated within the planning issues. But again, when we talk about the population growth and employment over there, we just recall about the issue of employment. As we have said that we're talking about the working force. The working force is determined by the number of people who are working. So there was a problem by then that in Tanzania, we are still having so many people who are unemployed. And we're not talking about employment, it's not about the formal sectors, but we're talking about informal sectors. So it was a call that all the institutions should think about the issue of investing so that we can be able to employ people. But again, for the aspect of the special group in the society, over there we consider about three aspects. It's about, they're talking about the children. Children have been considered as a special group in the society, but again, we have the so-called what? Aged people. Aged people. You remember we said 65 above, this is considered as aged people. They are no longer productive. Most of them, they're tired. But again, we have another group which is about the people with a disability. So the people with disability has been identified within the policy that they should be considered, they should be given the first priority. But again, you can recall, again within the so-called special group in the society, we have the so-called the refugees. Refugees. And when we say the refugees, you can just recall the situation in Tanzania that is starting 1960s. Tanzania has been hosting so many refugees from different countries, but it becomes to be more acute in 1994. Remember what happened, especially along those countries that are bordering the Great Lakes. We're talking about Rwanda, Burundi. You can call about the Rwanda genocide over there. We received so many refugees, especially around Kagera regions, even Kigoma. So they had so many effects within the environment, creation of the environment. But again, there were so many issues pertaining to the eruption of diseases. So the policy is trying to address those issues, has a special group in the society. For the special group in the society, it's about those considerations. When you talk about gender equity, I think you remember, the issue of gender equity is all about the issue of justice, and the fair consideration within the societies. But equality is all about the issue of having equal considerations in terms of the power within society. So it is encouraging that we should have gender equity, gender equality, so that we can be able to empower the women because they are responsible. And why are we saying that they're responsible? They are the ones who are dealing with the actual performance or the actual determinant of fertility. So if they are well educated, we expect that at the end of the day we'll be able to achieve the objective of the policy. But if they're not educated, that's why we find that there is a high birth rate. The issue of reproductive health is very important because we have to address the issues pertaining to the health aspect, which is related with production. But again, environmental conservation is very important, as we have seen that the environment in Tanzania, we have the data over there. They are saying that Tanzania is occupied by the forest plus we have the forest. According to the data, they are saying 50% of Tanzania is covered by the forest and the woodland. Forests plus woodland. But again, 40%, this is covered by grassland, and scrubs. But surprising enough, if you talk about the issue of environment in Tanzania, you'll find that according to the population policy, it's only 6 to 8% of the total area that has been cultivated. It has been cultivated. So if you compress over there, you find that we're still having a huge area in Tanzania which is not cultivated, and it's arable. So the policy was encouraging about the issue of conserving those environments in consideration with all the resources, being aquatic, with all the issues pertaining to the wetland. So those resources should be protected. And once we protect them, at the end of the day, we'll be able to support the future generations. But again, talking about the issue of cultivated area, again, we have the so-called agriculture, food, and nutrition. It's very important because if you don't have enough food, it's not easier to come up with healthy people or the healthy nations. So the policy is clear and stating or stressing about the issue of agriculture, food and nutrition. On the issue of education, it's a call upon that the education should be provided. As we can recall about the historical aspect connected with the, we are saying the developing countries. Again, we are still having the challenge in terms of the education. For instance, you can say this is the primary level, and then we have the secondary level, the university level. It's a challenge also over there because of the education which is being provided over there. For instance, you can set the following data. I think it was 2004. They are saying the transition from the primary school to secondary school, it was about 36.1% of people who graduated from the primary school, they managed to go to the secondary school. So you can just recall about the remaining percentage. Where are they? So the policy was addressing that particular component that is to be taken care of so that we can be able to achieve the population policy. But last, again, data collection, processing, and storage, dissemination, training, and the research, it's very important. You can just recall about the so-called the population census that we do conduct in Tanzania. It takes time to process them. Why are we taking time? Are we taking long time? It's all about the issue of technology and the other issues pertaining to those issues. So it's very important to have the data that will assist us to make decisions. If we don't have the data which is reliable, which is clearly compressed, it's not easier to make decisions. But lastly, so as I said, it's about advocacy, information, education, and communications. The issue of advocacy, nothing else rather it's about the activity which is done by the group or by the individual within the society intending to influence the decisions about so many issues. So again, the policy is addressing the so-called advocacy. But for the attainment of that particular policy, there's no way out. We should avoid the so-called advocacy. So advocacy is very important, cutting across all the sectors, talking about the issue connected with population policy, integrating it into development, and at the end of the day, you will find that the development will be changing from time to time. And at the end of the day, we attain the so-called what? Sustainable areas. So you can just recall about question number 4, according to our reflective questions, the question number 4, which was talking about evaluating 8 priority areas that has been pinpointed within the population policy of Tanzania, or within the explicit population policy. Explicit population policy. As I said, explicit population policy started since 1992. That's when we started the explicit population policy. So when you ask about the priority areas, as I've said, the 1992 population policy identified the priority areas on the 50 chapters. But again, when we come up to the revised one of 2006, also those priority areas were also clearly stipulated on what should be done so that we can harmonize the situations to have well development. So those are the issues pertaining to the so-called what? Explicit priority areas. When we give them priorities, automatically the policy will be attained, and again we will have managed to balance the so-called what? Population, environment, and development, and then we stay harmonious. But again, I just want to take you through the so-called the restrictive population policy. Restrictive population policy. We have the so-called restrictive. It's about the population, population control. Then we have restrictive. We have restrictive population policy. And over there, nothing else that we're talking about. We are just recalling about one-child policy. One-child policy, which was implemented in China during the 1970s. It's one of the cases that we can refer so that can assist us to have the so-called what? The general understanding about the policy, because we're talking about the policy. You can have a policy which is free or which is voluntary, but also you can have the policy which is very restrictive. When we talk about the population policy of one-child policy, we just recall about the situation in China before 1970s. Or during the 1970s. You can just have an overview concerning with, after the death of the so-called Mao Zedong, what happened. Before Mao Zedong in China, they used it to have the so-called what? Population policy, but that policy was voluntary. It was not having restrictive mechanisms. But later on, after his death, we have the so-called Huan Guofeng. He took off the office. Then he's the one who just stipulated clear what should be done so that control the populations. Then in 1978, when we come up with Deng Xiaoping, he's the one who came to power. And then he started to implement the restrictive measures which were written by Huan Guofeng. And then from there, we started with the so-called what? One-child population policy in China. But we can ask ourselves, what were the basic reasons? Why did they decide to come up with one-child policy in China? They decided to come up with one-child policy in China because they had three issues. The first one was about the issue of food. That was the food shortage, because the number of people was increasing. But again, they had the associated problems with populations. Take an example of social service provisions, the economic environments. But again, they had so many problems. So from there, they had to come up with the so-called what? The policy to control their populations. But also, they had they wanted to limit population growth. How was it implemented? It was implemented through different strategies. The first strategy that they used, it was about the so-called what? The provision of positive incentives. When I say provision of positive incentives, I think, remember, you can talk about the issue connected with healthcare, provision of loans, but again, they were being given the offer of accessing the better school if at all you manage to come up with or to manage to have one child. But again, they had the so-called provision of negative incentives. And when you say negative incentives, it means if you could not comply with that particular policy, you had to be given the penalty, or you had to be what? Penalized. Some pinch had to be falling upon you. That's what we call the provision of negative incentives. But again, they had regular inspections. They were passing through the village inspecting what's happening. They had exemptions, but again, they usually forced birth control measures. What were the limiting factors? The limiting factors included the so-called hiding the children, I think, remember. But again, they had the so-called what? Birth tourism. And when you say birth tourism, it means when somebody gets pregnant, he had to move from China. That was also another challenge for the Chinese. Then it was against the human rights. And lastly, we can talk about the challenge in terms of what? Of its implementation, especially in the rural areas. The impacts, it managed to control the population. So there was the decline in terms of the birth rate. Remember the introduction, we had the so-called demographic model. So it managed to control the populations. But again, there was a decline in terms of the population. They managed to control the populations of China. And again, the gender abuse was also another impact that resulted. But also, there was the so-called what? Shrinking, or the working force was affected. It was affected because there were so many things connected with it. But again, we have the domination of aged population. As we said from the beginning, that the aged population is a burden to the society or to the government. But again, there's harassment, and again, we end up with the violations of the human rights. But later on, Chinese decided to change, and then they come up with the so-called what? Relaxation policy, so that they can allow people to have more children. You can just recall on question number 5. Which is talking about assessing the impact of population policy in China. So, dear students, let us summarize our revision based on the following. I just want to make a recall. You can just recall about the set objectives that we had when we were starting that lesson, or we were starting that revisions. We said we just wanted to understand some concepts related with population development. I think we have done it. You can just recall and enroll them. But again, we said we are much targeting to the so-called what? Tracing the chronological background of population policy in Tanzania. And I think up to the moment you are aware that before 1992, we had a population policy, but that policy was not direct having an influence. But later on, we come up with the so-called what? Explicit population policy. I think you know that's from 1992. And then the 1992 population policy survived almost for 13 years. Then in 2006, it was revised. And up to the moment, we expect maybe to change that particular population policy so that we can accommodate the situations. But again, we have managed to draw a specific example of one of the restrictive population policies in the world, that is one-child population policy, which is implemented in China. You can just review it and check the strategies and the way how was it implemented. that marks the end of our session for today. But again, I just want to caution is because this is a continuation. So we'll be having another sessions connected with the fourth subtopic, which is all about population growth and social economic planning. Then the next sessions, please don't plan to miss it, because over there we'll be targeting three things. The first things we'll be talking about the so-called, we'll be establishing the relationship among population, environment and development. That will be the first issue when we start the next sessions. But again, we'll be assessing the general population problems facing the African continent. Because we have an overview, and I think you know that Africa is huge. It has a vast land with a population density of about 45 people per square kilometers, but it still is facing so many problems. So we'll be having an overview connected with the population problems pertaining to African continent. And again, we'll be able to evaluate the environmental population problems, or the problem caused by the populations, especially in the urban areas. And we'll be setting our example from Tanzanian context. That will be the next sessions that we'll be taking on, or we'll be having. So dear students, plan not to miss it. And that marks the end of the session for today. Thank you. Have a nice time.